In today's video, I fill seam lines, chip paint with water and brushes, simulate exhaust smoke, and much more. The kit I'm building in today's video is Eduard's Hawker Tempest Mark V in 1/48 scale. I've had this kit in my collection for a while now, and it's really nice to finally get around to start building it. I was actually really excited to build this kit because of all the great detail I've seen and the great reviews. Just by looking at the fuselage, I could see a lot of really nice details, such as both raised and recessed rivets, highlighting the realism that's been put into this kit. The decals themselves actually seem to be very high quality, and even included a bunch of small markings for all of the little screws and rivets, which there's no way I'm putting those on. It also came with some photo etch and masking for the kit, which was a nice bonus. The instructions themselves were very detailed and seemed to be easy to follow. Markings wise, there were a lot of really cool schemes I could have chosen, but in the end I ultimately ended up going for this one. Just like any other build, I start the process by cutting all the parts off the sprue and categorizing them into a small container. Once the step has been completed, I can then start on working on building the small assemblies for the interior process, such as the chair and the control column. Another important part in this process is modifying all the pieces that need to be replaced or modified with photo etch parts, which, in my opinion, are objectively better. I assemble all these metal and photo etch parts with Gorilla Superglue. While waiting for the previous steps to dry, I can also work on assembling the air intake. This part of the process was actually quite enjoyable, as all the parts fit together really well. Then again, it's to be expected of Eduard. I can also attach some smaller parts to the inside of the fuselage before painting. Before I go ahead and paint, I laid out a coat of AK black primer to make sure the paint adheres to the plastic a lot better. To achieve a chipping effect, I spray down some Vallejo metal color aluminum. I then spray down some AK Worn Effects chipping fluid. This helps to create a barrier between the metal paint and the standard paint for the chipping effects. Once dry, I can start on painting, which I first start with Vallejo black. After masking off all the black, I then spray down some Vallejo interior gray-green. This is the closest color I could get to what was actually used on British aircraft during the Second World War. Once all of the paint is set and dried, I soaked everything with some water. This activated all of the chipping fluid underneath, which allowed me to scrape away the paint with a toothpick. For all the small details I couldn't airbrush, I brush painted them with a fine brush in Vallejo acrylics, in this case, Vallejo black. Once everything has been painted, I can then prep the surface for weathering using a Vallejo gloss varnish. It's important to use the acrylic form, as enamels won't affect this. For other photo etch assemblies, I stick to the theme by using Gorilla Superglue. I largely did most of the assemblies off camera since these small pieces were an absolute pain to do while filming. For weathering, I apply a simple AK dark brown wash. This not only helps to accent the panel lines, but also helps to dull down the quote-unquote pristine paint. Once semi-dry, I can wipe away all the excess with a cotton bud. This helps to achieve a dull or dirty effect to all of the paint, as shown here. Once all the major weathering has been completed, I can then apply the last footage details, which would be the seatbelts. To seal in all the weathering I've done and to unify the overall look, I apply a coat of Vallejo matte varnish. While this technically isn't the most realistic approach, I still like to do this anyway because it looks cool. In order to accentuate all the details that have been painted black, I go over with a very light coat of Tamiya IGN Grey as dry brushing. This also helps to dull down the black and makes it less stark to look at. With that out of the way, I can then move on to completing all the major assemblies for the final interior assembly. Before I had forgotten, I made sure to paint all of the dial fronts with a gloss varnish. This helped achieve a glass look, which in turn made it look more realistic. I also noticed the small button on the handle that needed to be painted. With all of that out of the way, I could then move on to the final assembly for the interior, which I start with the air intake. While holding the two fuselage halves together, I run a line of Tamiya ultra thin glue down this seam line. This reduces the chance of having a large gap during the finished product, which helps me with sanding. Unfortunately, these gaps are kind of inevitable. To combat this, I taped off the area I will be puttying with some Tamiya masking tape. This will act as a guideline when applying the putty to ensure there's no overspill and unnecessary cleanup. To fill in the seam line, I use AK modeling grade putty. This stuff is better for smaller seams and gaps, as shown here. For larger issues, I would recommend Tamiya products. The main reason being this stuff tends to deflate on those types of things and isn't very desirable or effective. Once dry, I can sand away all of the excess putty with a large metal file. This is then followed by a more gentle Tamiya sanding sponge. Before I can move on to the glass assemblies like the canopy, I have to mask it off with the provided masking tape. Since it's designed by the makers of the kit, this tends to be very accurate and goes off without a hitch. For the larger uncovered areas, I use Mr. Hobby masking fluid to protect the canopy from the paint. Once this is all set and dry, I apply all the important clear parts, such as the windshield. Before I can work on all the major painting, I have to adjust the smaller builds. In this case, I sand down all the seam lines in the tires. This helps to achieve a more realistic and smoother look. Once all the smaller assemblies have been done and dealt with, I can then move on to priming the aircraft itself. I also make sure to spray all the necessary parts still on the sprue. The reason I spray these on the sprue is to eliminate the need to dirty up more part holders. One thing I do for all of my aircraft builds is applying some pre-shading with Vallejo white gray. This helps to further accentuate the panel lines during the final product. Similar to what I did with the interior, I apply some Vallejo metal color aluminum to the wingtips. This is to once again achieve a nice chipping look. After laying down a coat of chipping varnish and paint, I can then move on to the chipping. This, of course, starts with wetting the surface with water. This is where I attempt to chip the paint by applying a considerable amount of force with a dampened brush. While this was slightly effective, I would not recommend doing this method as it did chip down to the bare plastic. To fix this issue, I just painted away all the areas that were chipped down to plastic with some Vallejo chrome. I also wanted to apply this method for the walkway, so I repeated the same steps, this time using Vallejo black. Behind the cockpit, there was a small area that needed to be painted black. I ended up hand brushing this since it wasn't worth the effort to airbrush this. For the final details of painting the aircraft, I painted the rear stripe using Vallejo Skytype S. After this, I painted the invasion stripes on the bottom of the fuselage. It's fairly common to see invasion stripes painted on both the fuselage and the wings of a Hawk or Tempest, however, this variant only calls for it to be painted on the fuselage. For the exhausts, I paint them with hull red. This will act as a base for further weathering later. When painting tires, I always use Tamiya rubber black. While it may not be too noticeable since they're already painted with black primer, I really do recommend this step as it is noticeable in the end. Once everything has been painted, I can then prep the surface with an all-clad lacquer gloss. This helps to smooth out the surface for the decal applying stage. After letting the varnish set completely for a day, I can then move on to decals. This starts by applying a small coat of micro set. This is a crucial step in making sure that the decal adheres to the surface correctly, as well as conforming to all the details. I also make sure to squeeze out any of the excess with a cotton bud. To make sure that the decal is nice and flat against the surface, I apply some microsol. This essentially melts the decal to the surface, which in turn helps it to conform to all the details. After sealing in all the decals with another coat of lacquer varnish, I can then move on to the weathering. This begins by applying an overall wash in enamel form. Similar to what was done with the interior, I waited until that the wash was semi-dry to wipe it away. This created small effects like streaking, and also helped to make the surface look less monotone. Using a small amount of oil paints, I highlighted all of the edges of the control surfaces with some dark brown. While it is a subtle effect, the camera doesn't pick it up very well, and it does look a lot more pronounced in person. I also do these with the pan lines to dirty up the overall surface and to highlight them. Behind the air intake, there would be small leaks of things such as hydraulic fluid and oil, so I recreate this effect with the same brown oils. It may seem weird that I'm using the same oils for the different effects, but they are quite versatile and can look different in certain circumstances. To all the latches and fuel tanks, I also made sure to add some streaking. For the propeller, I dry brush some Vallejo chrome onto the edge. This helps to simulate scratches that would have been caused by any debris on either the runway or the taxiway. For the exhaust, I use a similar technique as to what I did with my Halifax. I first wet the surface with Tamiya brown accent color. It's also important to dab away all the excess with a cotton bud. I can then apply some pigments to help simulate texture and also to alter the color. Once dry, I also added some rust pigments to add some variations in tone. With some lighter oils, I can also simulate fuel streaks from the external fuel tanks. For the final stage of weathering, I apply some post shading with very diluted Vallejo black. This can introduce variations in tone and giving an overall more pleasing look. I also use this exact same method when creating a base for the exhaust smoke. Before I seal everything in, I apply some concrete pigment to the exhausts. While this may not be visible in the end, it will still show up in the panel lines, which is an effect I want to get. To seal in all the weathering effects, I apply a coat of Vallejo matte varnish. Again, while this may not be the most realistic effect, it's still one I like to do. After waiting for this to dry, I can apply some AK smoke pigment to add some alterations to the exhaust that I couldn't achieve using an airbrush. I then reapply all the concrete pigments from before to achieve a more burnt look to the exhaust. Moving on to the final stretch, I do all the assemblies I forgot to do earlier, such as the tires. For most of the lights on the underside of the aircraft, I paint all the red elements with Testor's Model Master Transparent Red. Then for the greens, I use Tamiya Transparent Green. It is absolutely crucial to do this after the matte varnishing, since the matte varnish will fog these elements up. With that out of the way, I can then move on to the final assembly. I begin this by applying the fuel tanks, as well as the other elements such as a PDOT tube. To ensure the aircraft is sturdy when it's standing, I attach all of the wheels and other landing gear assemblies with Gorilla Superglue. With that completed, I can finally see the aircraft standing under its own weight. In the final stretch, I can finally attach things like the exhaust ports and the canopy. For the absolute final step on this process, I attach the prop to the aircraft. After 3 months of work, the build is finally done, and here is the finished product.